I was standing in the attic, surrounded by dust and memories that seemed to have penetrated into every corner of this long-forgotten space. The whole setting, old wooden beams, moldy boxes, and objects gently touched by time, reminded me of how much I had left behind. It was as if life itself was frozen here, shrouded in a quiet, almost prayerful silence. And so, in the midst of this abandoned shadow, my wedding dress hung, snow white and untouched, as a symbol of the future that I once imagined so vividly. It hung in a garment bag, as if hidden under a veil of obscurity, ready to become part of some brighter moment. I'll be Mrs. Brian Hunter tomorrow. This thought should have filled me with joy, but instead I felt somehow uncomfortable, as if everything around me began to crack at the seams. Anxiety, like a nagging pain in my stomach, crept up on me, and I involuntarily turned around in the silence of the attic, as if expecting to see someone or something that would make me change my mind. "Justine, are you still up there?" My sister Louise's voice broke through the walls of this old house, and I shuddered as if I had broken out of a deep sleep. I couldn't answer anything for a minute, just called back, reaching for another box. But when I picked it up and opened it, an old, yellowed envelope slipped out of it. He was thin and fragile, like life itself, which seemed completely out of control to me now. Curiosity got the better of me, as always, and I opened the envelope. There was a photo inside that gave me a jolt. I almost dropped the box when I saw Brian's face, my Brian. He was standing in the photo, hugging a woman I didn't know. She was pregnant, and both of them seemed to radiate happiness. A couple who looked at each other with such tenderness that their every look was full of promises and warm words that I thought Brian and I had never spoken out loud. I turned the photo over with difficulty, and on the back I saw the familiar scribble of Brian's letters. "Clara and I have been together for 6 months." This modest, but so scary text for me cut a void out of my heart. Clara? Who is it? Why didn't I know anything about her? I froze, unable to take my eyes off those words, as if they were a spell that was filling my mind with fear and pain right now. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Thoughts raced through my head, but none could find their logical conclusion. Suddenly, Louise appeared in the attic doorway. She was already at the top, after an eternity, as if the stairs themselves resisted her in her desire to come to my aid. I didn't seem to notice how she got up. I was so engrossed in these strange, frightening thoughts. "What's wrong?" "What is it?" she asked, and I silently handed her the photo. Louise's eyes widened, and there was such an astonished, but rather indignant look on her face that I immediately felt uneasy. She looked at me, and then at the photo, and then she said, "Oh, honey, when was this done?" I shook my head, not knowing what to say. "I don't know, Lou. But look at the backside." Louise turned the photo over, and a facial expression appeared on her face, as if she had just encountered some kind of horror. "Clara. Who the hell is Clara?" Her voice was strained, and even I could feel the threat in the air. My silence became long and it was full of confusion. "I have no idea," I replied, and my voice sounded as if it was a stranger even to myself. It wasn't me, it wasn't my life, these words didn't belong to me, and I didn't know what to do with them. Louise stood silently looking at me, trying to figure out what was going on. I lowered my head, but then the phone rang. I pulled it out of my pocket, frowning at the unfamiliar number. To answer or not to answer? As if in revenge for everything that was happening, I decided to pick up the phone. "Hello, is this Brian's wife?" A cheerful female voice reached me a second later. My heart stopped. My throat was immediately dry, and I couldn't say a word. The silence lasted for ages before I finally mumbled. Who is this?" "Oh, it's Clara. I got your number from Brian's phone. I hope you're all right. I just wanted to clarify about the baby shower next month." Her words crept over me like a cold stream of water, and I felt the world around me crumble. The world that was supposed to be mine tomorrow turned out to be full of monstrous secrets. I knew that there were only a few hours left before the wedding, and everything should have been ready, but at that moment I decided that something needed to be added to the calendar, as something that could not be delayed, as an inevitable item that could not be missed. I dialed Clara's number without thinking, without weighing my words. However, when the room spun around me and I had to grab the edge of the trunk to hold on, I felt that my thoughts, like this spinning world, could not find stability. "I'm sorry, Clara," I said, desperately trying to regain control of myself. "I think there's been some mistake. Brian and I are not married yet. The wedding is tomorrow." There was a silence on the other end of the line, so long and heavy that I thought I could hear the raindrops pattering on the glass. Then Clara spoke, and her voice was low, confused, as if she didn't know how to react to my words. "What do you mean? Tomorrow?" Her question was barely audible, like a shadow of doubt sliding across the dark corners of the night. "Brian told me that you two got married last year." I closed my eyes, and at that moment I wanted it all to become just a nightmare that I could wake up to. My stomach clenched, and I felt the ground give out from under my feet. I've been trying to figure out what's going on, but there's only one question in my head: how is this possible? "Clara, I think we need to talk," I said, and my words sounded as if they had been spoken by someone else. "Can you meet me?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. She obviously struggled with the offer, but soon responded, stunned but with surprising determination. "Of course," she said, and I wrote down the address of the cafe, which was very close to my house. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up, and the moment the phone went silent, Louise was there. "She's already grabbed my purse and keys." "I'll come with you," she said firmly, and I felt such confidence in her voice that it made it easier for me to breathe. I nodded, grateful for her strength, and we went down the attic stairs, my foot acutely feeling every step. I caught a glimpse of a wedding dress hanging in a garment bag, motionless and unapproachable. This one, which was supposed to be a symbol of a new beginning, was now like an instrument of ridicule, almost mocking me. After all, the future that I had been waiting for so long turned out to be just an illusion. What if he has an explanation? I asked Louise as we got into her car. Louise snorted, grinning with a certain sarcastic tinge. "Unless he has an evil twin that we don't know about." I couldn't answer because everything inside me was spinning like a whirlwind in endless questions and doubts. How many years has Brian been living this double life? What else did he lie to me about? We drove in silence, each of these questions hitting me harder, like a wave covering my head. All those years that I spent with him, all those words that he told me, everything seemed to be a lie. When we arrived at the cafe, I saw her, a pregnant woman waiting outside. She nervously twisted the ring on her left hand, and it became difficult for me to breathe. I recognized her immediately, despite all the changes. Her face was what I saw in the photo. It was her. It was Clara. "It's her," I whispered, and Louise squeezed my hand, as if trying to convey her strength and confidence. "Remember, you are the offended party here. Keep your head high." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of this moment fall on me. We both got out of the car, and I felt the ground give way under my feet. With every step, the truth was coming closer to me, and I was preparing to face it face to face. The curse of this moment could not be undone. When I approached Clara, her eyes widened and her reaction was as if she had just met a ghost. There was a mixture of surprise and regret in her voice. "You must be Justine," she said, her words trembling, and I felt her apology pierce my chest. "I'm so sorry." I raised my hand, interrupting her, not wanting to hear any more. Everything was said, and I couldn't handle what she was trying to explain. A conversation inside, at a table in the corner, was inevitable. Louise and I sat at a nearby table, watching Clara, who seemed unable to calm the trembling hands clutching her swollen belly. I didn't know which tormented me more, his dissection or her suffering. She was so vulnerable that for a moment I felt my anger give way to pity, but then, remembering everything that had happened, my heart sank again. How long have I been asking myself this question, trying to find the slightest explanation for what is happening? But when Clara finally spoke, her voice was frail and tired, as if every word was difficult for her. "Brian and I met 3 years ago," she said, and I felt her voice grow heavy, as if she was carrying a burden that she couldn't hide anymore. "He told me he was divorced. That he had problems with his ex-wife, with custody arrangements. That's why he traveled so often." At that moment, my stomach twisted, as if something heavy had closed in my chest. 3 years. 3 years that became a lie. Half of our relationship was made up by him. Clara's words echoed in my head like a thunderbolt. "You got married?" I asked, unable to hide my bitterness. "You said you got married. Last year, in Vegas? Was it spontaneous, romantic?" Clara's eyes were full of tears, almost invisible, but I saw them flash when she talked about it. Her every word cut through me like a knife. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a confession of her pain, of her dissection, of how her life had collapsed. I leaned back in my chair, my thoughts were confused, and all this horror clenched somewhere in my chest. My gaze couldn't tear away from her face, and I felt every breath she took penetrate me deeper. And the baby. Brian was so excited when he talked about names. He bought little outfits. Her voice became weak, and the words came out like a whisper. Brian was so happy. Her last sentence hit me like a physical blow. I imagined Brian, whom I knew so well, hanging over children's outfits, choosing names, as if it wasn't related to someone else, someone I didn't know. I felt my own hands start to shake, and I could barely hold back the tears. "Clara," I said, forcing myself to speak firmly despite everything that was going on inside, "I need you to listen to me carefully. Brian was lying. We both knew he was lying, but we were lying to ourselves too." Clara couldn't seem to believe what I was saying. She turned pale and her face went blank, as if everything she believed in had collapsed at that moment. She tried to justify him, but my words, like an icy rain, hammered the truth into her head. "No, it's impossible," she whispered, her eyes full of fear. "He couldn't have done it. He couldn't do this to us." "He did it," I replied firmly, and there was such determination in my voice that I couldn't turn back. "I have proof." I pulled out my phone, and without giving her time to object, I showed her a photo that I found in my old box. When Clara saw the picture, her hand involuntarily went to her face, and a strangled sigh escaped from her throat. She literally fell backwards, her face contorted with pain and rage. "Son of a bitch," she whispered, and her words cut through me like a blade. Oh my God, how could he do this to us? I could hear her pain, but she couldn't understand the depth to which I felt her pain. She was exposed, but I knew I wasn't any better. We both turned out to be deceived, and I felt like the walls that I had built around myself began to crumble. When Clara broke down, Louise appeared next to me, her presence like a shield ready to protect me from destruction. She put her hand on my shoulder, and I felt her strength give me hope again. "It's all right," she said softly. I nodded, unable to answer. Louise was always there for me, always ready to support me, but now I knew that what we were going through couldn't be fixed with just words. I turned back to Clara. My gaze was as steady as ever. "I know it's a shock, but I need your help. Brian has to face the consequences of what he did. We can't let him get away with it." Clara wiped her eyes, and in her gaze, which had just been full of despair, now there was something new, a spark of anger. And even though her feelings were wavering, I could see that she was ready to fight, just like me. "What was on your mind?" she asked, and her voice was filled with determination. Over the next hour, we worked out a plan. Clara was supposed to meet with Brian that night and record their conversation so that we would have proof. And I had to delve into his deception, figure out how he arranged it all. We shared responsibilities, but in my heart I already knew that this would be just the beginning. We couldn't let him get away with it. Brian had to find out that the deception was exposed sooner or later. When we parted, Clara grabbed my hand, and her voice became warm again, full of regret. "Justine, I'm really sorry. If I'd known it wasn't your fault." Her words seemed sincere, and I felt her pity pierce through me. I couldn't answer. Everything was said. At home, I went into investigative mode. Hacked Brian's email. His password turned out to be the date of our anniversary. The irony of fate could not escape me. When I logged into his email, I was ready to see everything. I found a lot of compromising messages, correspondence in which Brian openly discussed his life with other women. There, among the emails, love notes and work correspondence, I discovered even more of what was destroying my world. There was so much evidence, so much betrayal, that I could barely digest it all. The folder with the photos was especially burning, intimate moments captured in the pictures that Brian sent to Clara, as if it were the most ordinary day. There were ultrasound images marked ours. These pictures, like a small miracle, have already begun not only to destroy my idea of Brian, but also about our whole life. A small miracle. I squinted at the phone screen as it vibrated again, signaling a new message. "Clara." "Justine, I did it," she said, her voice trembling, and I could feel a whole world of pain and destruction hiding in those words. I ran into him. "Everything is recorded." That's all he said. There was a heaviness in her voice. At first he tried to deny everything, but then he couldn't stand it. He confessed. He said he loved us both. I couldn't choose. I listened to her words, and at that moment I felt bitterness fill me. How could I not have noticed this before? How could I be so blind? It's amazing how he continued to stand in front of us and talk about love, while leading a double life, deceiving both of us. "Thank you, Clara," I whispered, feeling as if her help had become the only source of light in this darkness. "You have no idea how much it helps." But before I could process what I had heard, Louise burst into the room with a look of panic on her face. "Justine, we have a problem," she said, sounding worried. "Brian's on his way." Panic seized me. Thoughts flashed through my head, disturbing premonitions, but I couldn't believe it had happened so quickly. Why did he come to me with this dirty lie again? Why did you call me frantic? "He said he needed to talk to you." Louise almost screamed. The desperation in her voice was obvious. "He said that there was some kind of mistake, misunderstanding." I laughed bitterly, overcome by a mixture of despair and rage. "Oh, yes, I'd say it was more than just a misunderstanding," I blurted out. My words sounded with obvious mockery. "But still, he comes into my house as if nothing had happened. I don't think he understands what he's going to face." Louise looked at me with a glint of fury in her eyes. Her determination was so strong that I felt her energy permeate me. "What do you want to do?" "What is it?" she asked, and there was a threat in her voice. I squared my shoulders, standing straight, and answered, feeling the poison of the truth slowly seeping into my soul with every word. "I want to hear what lies he's going to spin, and then." I paused, my heart clenching in my chest, but I continued, "I want to look him in the eye when I tell him that I know everything." The doorbell rang, and I stood up as if I'd given up at the last moment. Louise's gaze met mine, and despite the gravity of the moment, I caught in her eyes something similar to what I felt myself, determination. We were ready. "Showtime," I muttered, walking to the door where I would see him, the one who destroyed my world. My heart was pounding faster with every step toward the door. I opened it, and there he was. Brian. His face was a mask of despair, and I felt my insides tighten. But it wasn't anxiety, it was more than that. I just wanted to know exactly what words he would use to justify everything he had done. "Justine, thank God, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the hallway, where Louise met him, standing with her arms crossed over her chest. She looked at him, and on her face was all I needed to see, displeasure and determination. Her gaze was as sharp as a knife. "I think you've said enough, Brian," she said firmly, her voice as cold as ice. He turned between us, and I noticed how confusion instantly clouded his face. He didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to get out of this maze of lies. "What's going on?" His voice was confused, but I saw in his eyes not only surprise, but also weakness. His confidence began to fade. I laughed bitterly, not trying to hide my anger. It was too funny to take seriously. "Funny," I said, sarcasm in my voice. "I was going to ask you the same thing. You thought you were hiding everything, didn't you?" His eyes widened, and I felt his soul freeze with horror as I said, "I know everything about Clara, about your son. About what you've been hiding." The color on his face disappeared like a shadow. He turned pale like a ghost. But I didn't feel sorry anymore. "How did you know that?" he almost whispered. "It doesn't matter," I interrupted him. "What matters is that you got caught. You're lying down." Brian collapsed onto the couch as if his body had lost all its resilience. His head was in his hands. He closed his eyes, trying to ease the pain a little, but it was already impossible. I've never seen him so broken, so helpless. His face was distorted with despair, from the realization that he had not only lost me, but also destroyed everything he once had. "I never wanted this to happen." His voice was trembling, and it was hard for me to tell if it was genuine regret or just fear for myself. "I love you both. You are exactly what I demanded. I thought we could all play happy families with two different women." He looked at me, there were tears in his eyes, but there was no remorse or repentance. In them, I saw only regret for myself, for my dissatisfaction, which he was trying to fill at our expense. "I know I screwed up, but we can." His words trailed off as he tried to find an excuse, but I didn't let him continue. "No, Brian," I said softly but firmly. "We can't. You've ruined everything yourself. And there is no way to fix it." Louise snorted. Her anger was like a fire burning inside her. Her voice was full of contempt. "It's impossible to fix it." I raised my hand, silencing them both. Everything inside me was turning over, but I knew that it was important to hear him now. It was important to understand what other lies he was ready to go to. "Come on, Brian," I looked at him, not hiding my despair. "Explain how you're going to fix this." He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage for a last, desperate offer. "I'm going to finish with Clara. I'll pay alimony, but I won't be in their lives. You and I can start all over again, move if necessary. Everything will be different. Do you believe me?" His words hung in the air, and at that moment I felt something inside me break. The boldness of his offer was so hypocritical that I just couldn't believe his sincerity. Louise couldn't stand it. "You miserable coward," her words were like a knife stab. "Would you leave your own child in order for everything to remain as before?" Brian flinched at her words. He stood there, not knowing how to react, but continued to fight for what he thought was his last chance. "I'm trying to save everything I can, Justine." His voice became almost pleading, but I couldn't listen anymore. "Please, we can still be happy. We can." Something about his request was so humiliating that I could barely stand it. The words cut me like knives, but I couldn't afford to believe anymore. "I've lost everything I ever thought about him. After everything you've done, do you still believe that we can live happily ever after?" I couldn't hide the bitterness in my voice. "You've been living a double life, Brian. You married another woman, you have a child with her, and you think we can just pretend that nothing happened? I felt his hand reach out to me, but I pulled away. Everything I once felt is gone. He lost me. Forever. I love you, Justine. His words sounded like the last confession I couldn't accept. I've always loved you. No, my answer was cold, icy as a winter wind. You don't love me. You don't even know what love is. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. We all froze, and time seemed to stop. Louise went to open the door, and I felt the tension in the air growing. A few moments later, she returned with Clara, her face white with excitement. Clara gasped. Her face looked haggard, her eyes were red, but she stood firm. Brian, what are you doing here? He jumped up as if he hadn't expected to see her. What are you doing here? His voice was nervous, full of panic. Clara didn't move. Her gaze was steady and her voice was resolute. I'm here to make sure you face the consequences of your actions, Brian. She took a step forward, placing her hand on her swollen stomach as if to confirm her words. We're not here to fight over you. We're here to make sure you understand what you've done. Louise, without saying a word, took out her laptop and put it on the coffee table. I knew that the moment of truth would come now. We had all gathered the evidence, and now he had to face what he had created himself. Why don't we all watch the tape you made with Clara? Louise turned on her laptop and the screen lit up. Brian, would you like to hear how you explain your actions while we watch Clara talk to you? All eyes were on the screen, and every second I felt the air getting denser. I saw his face crumple, as if his own body was responding with pain from every look, from every exposure. Every lie, every naked excuse, is like a knife stabbing into a wound. All that remained was a heavy silence that filled the room, thick as if the atmosphere itself was trying to engulf us. We were all too far away to come back. And it was obvious. I couldn't sit in silence anymore. To relieve the tension, I spoke, although I did not believe in my words. Anyway, it was as if I needed to somehow feel in control, at least a little bit, to believe that there was a chance that he could change something else. Do you still think we can fix this? I asked, and these words sounded like an empty hope, not worth even one breath. Brian covered his face with his hands, and I felt sorry for him. No, not because I could still feel sorry for him, but rather because of how desperately he was trying to find the strength to justify himself. I'm very sorry, he said, his voice trembling like a child who realizes that he has been caught in something that cannot be forgiven. I'm so sorry. Clara shook her head, and her expression was full of disgust. Her words were short and sharp as a blade. That's not enough, Brian. Not even close. I stood up. Suddenly, I felt a calmness fill me like a cold lake, absorbing everything that had been before. My heart was no longer beating in panic, and my head was clear and determined. I knew what I had to do. I think it's time for you to leave, I told him without raising my voice. We're done. His eyes filled with despair. He looked at me as if I were the last hope. He tried to find something in my face that could justify him, but his words had no power. Justine, please, no. His voice trembled with pleading. But I interrupted him. Isn't that right? I replied, and my voice was firm. I can't beg, Brian. You can't explain. You've lost everything. Now get out of my house, I said, and there was no room for doubt in those words. Louise silently got up, went to the door and opened it without saying a word. Brian, shocked that he had already been kicked out, slowly stood up, and I saw his shoulders hunch as he left, like a man who had lost all dignity. He was like a dying star burning up from its own light. As soon as the door closed, I turned to Clara. She was standing in the room, her eyes were full of tears, but she didn't try to hide them. She nodded, and I saw strength in her movement, strength that she had lacked before. "Are you okay?" I asked, her concern so clearly visible on her face. She nodded softly, her voice barely audible. "I will," she paused, taking a deep breath. "But sooner or later I will be." "What about me?" I couldn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how I felt, I wasn't sure what to do. But there was one thing I knew for sure: we were both better off without him. Clara and I shared that moment of understanding that disappeared into thin air, like a mist that dissolves in the light of the morning sun. Louise, who was standing next to us, looked at us with a determined gleam in her eyes. She knew that we had to act now, that everything that was happening was just the beginning. "What is our next step?" "What is it?" she asked, and there was confidence in her voice. I raised my head, feeling a plan forming inside me. A plan that was not only revenge, but also salvation. "We need to make sure everyone knows exactly who Brian Hunter really is," I said, and although I wasn't sure about every step, I knew that this was exactly what needed to be done. We had to reveal the truth so that no one could continue to live in this nightmare. The next morning, after my encounter with Brian had completely shattered my illusions, I woke up with a sense of purpose that seemed like a long-forgotten state. I felt a strength and clarity that I hadn't felt in days. When I entered the kitchen, Louise was already sitting at the table, sipping a cup of coffee. Her face was calm, but there was the same gleam of determination in her eyes that I noticed yesterday. "Are you ready for this?" "What is it?" she asked, pushing the mug towards me. I nodded, turning on my laptop and starting to search for the necessary documents. The time has come. Now we had to see how deep this rabbit hole was. We spent hours going through Brian's emails, his financial records, and credentials. Every discovery was like a fresh wound, but I no longer felt pain. It was a process that I had to go through. Deciding to reveal the full extent of his dissection, I glanced at the screen, where Louise was already pointing out a series of transactions that Brian had been transferring to a separate account for years. "Look at this," Louise said, her voice low but full of tension. "That's what he was hiding." My stomach twisted. I felt the world shrink around me when I realized that this money was his savings for another family. For the world he built without me, right under our noses. When we dug deeper, it turned out that Brian's business trips coincided with Clara's visits to the doctor. The lavish gifts I bought on the days when I thought he was working late turned out to be a hidden part of this life that I didn't know anything about. Even the down payment on the house, registered in Clara's name, was all part of what he was hiding. Louise muttered something under her breath and looked at me. He lived a completely different life right under our noses. Just then, my phone vibrated, interrupting my concentration. It was Clara. "Justine, I think you need to see this." Her voice trembled, as if she couldn't believe what she had found. "I found the key to the vault in Brian's things. Can you meet me there in 30 minutes? I felt something tighten inside me, as if the very thought that we might stumble upon another proof of his lies was pulling me out of a state of long-suppressed expectation. I quickly nodded to Louise, who was standing next to me, and without wasting any time, we both went to the place where all this falsehood seemed to be hidden. The nondescript warehouse was located in an old neighborhood where even the day seemed gray, not too appropriate for something important. Clara was waiting at the entrance, her face pale and her eyes seemed to have gone out. I slowed my steps, feeling how hard everything was going for her. "I haven't come in yet," Clara said, stopping me in my tracks. "I'm afraid of what we might find." Her words echoed in my head, and I realized that she wasn't just worried about herself. It was more than that. She didn't know what could be worse than what she had already learned, but she had a premonition that this chapter would be even darker than everything that had happened before. Louise took my hand and we walked over to the metal block. The lock clicked when I turned the key, and the door opened with a characteristic creak, like in old movies, where the discovery of hidden rooms always portends something terrifying. It was dark inside, but it was immediately clear that this was not just a warehouse of things. It was a place where life was hidden. His life. Stretched through boxes and old furniture, which in turn hid nothing but creepy secrets. Louise, standing next to me, exhaled. What does all this mean? It's not just a warehouse, Justine. It's a whole life, hidden and hidden. We began to sort out the boxes, and it became clearer by the second that there were more than just forgotten things here. Some of the boxes contained things that would seem to have no value. But in others, there are photos. Photo albums documenting Brian's relationship with Clara. Among them were photos of their trip to Las Vegas together, moments that were hidden from me behind this fake daily life. In one of the pictures, Brian and Clara were hugging in their wedding dresses. I stood and looked at it, not believing that anyone could live so shamelessly among lies. But that wasn't all. I noticed children's clothes, toys, and even a crib, still packed in a box. Clara, holding a folder of documents in her hands, said in a restrained voice, "It was for you. I think he was going to leave it all to you. He was going to go on with his life as if I wasn't there." I felt my stomach clench heavily. These words sounded like a sentence. His plans were not just to continue two lives, but to disappear completely. He was going to leave me without even thinking, take everything he wanted for himself and his new family, and leave me in the past as an unnecessary thing. We continued to take apart the boxes, and each new item seemed like another nail in his coffin. From time to time, I felt the reality change. Everything that I once thought of as my life now looked like a lie. It wasn't just exposing his falsehood. No, it was more than that. It was about making sure he faced the consequences of his actions. We had to do it right. "We need to document everything," I said firmly, despite the inner turmoil that was heating up in my chest. Photos, videos, inventory lists. We're going to make sure he can't get out of this. Louise nodded, her hand already pulling out her phone, preparing to start recording. She knew it was necessary. Clara also did not lag behind, and after a little hesitation, she straightened her shoulders and declared, without hiding her determination, "I'm in business. He won't be able to get out of here unscathed." Over the next few hours, we carefully cataloged every item in the vault, every piece of evidence, every moment that could expose him definitively. I could feel the resolve strengthening in each of us. Brian had taken away years of my life, my trust, my love, and now he was just going to throw me away like an unnecessary thing, without any remorse. But I couldn't let him do that anymore. Not now. Not with what we found. When we were done, I turned to Clara and Louise, and at that moment, as if the universe itself had given me the right impulse, I made a decision. My words burst out like sparks from a burning bonfire, and I couldn't stop them even if I wanted to. "The wedding is still going on," I said, unable to hide my determination. I saw the way they stared at me, as if I had just announced that I was going to be the queen of the world. The shock was on their faces, and they must have been wondering what was going on in my head. "What are you talking about?" Louise asked in disbelief. I smiled, but there was no joy or kindness in the gesture. It was a grin full of fierce determination, with something sharp that I could barely comprehend, but I knew for sure that this moment would be a turning point. The plan was forming in my head, clearly and clearly. Brian wants a wedding, he's going to get one. But it won't be the wedding he expects. She will be completely different. Clara's eyes widened in realization. She couldn't believe that I was really going to expose him, and especially to do it at the wedding. "Are you going to expose him at the wedding?" "What is it?" she asked, almost in a whisper. I nodded, burning with fierce determination. It wasn't just a moment of revenge, it was retribution. Everyone he had ever loved or shared his life with had to see who Brian Hunter really was. His life was built on lies, and now he will face what he brought into this world. Louise grinned. Her eyes sparkled with an evil gleam, and I realized that she shared my opinion. She was ready to be by my side in this. And then she said, "Now it's a wedding." I wouldn't have missed it for anything. There was something in her voice that made me feel like I wasn't alone in this. She was with me, despite all the crazy complexity of this path. When we came out of the vault and locked up all the physical evidence of Brian's deception, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. All that I carried inside me, those days of longing and uncertainty, disappeared. The way forward, no doubt, will not be easy, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt that everything was now in my hands. I'm in control of the situation. I had always been in control of her, but now I was ready to act. To think that Brian, who could have made fools of us all, now finds out that there is such a rage that can burn everything in its path. A despised woman who is not afraid to act. A woman ready to tear his world apart. The morning of the wedding came, and it was as bright and clear as ever. It was a contrast, a bright and calm dawn, as if the world did not know that a storm was raging inside me. My hair and makeup team fussed around me as if everything was normal, as if there was nothing terrible, but I felt every detail of it. I was sitting in front of the mirror, but there was not the slightest softness in my gaze. I knew what was waiting for me. I caught Louise's gaze in the reflection, and her whisper was almost soundless. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her eyes full of concern and understanding, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. I nodded slightly. My heart was beating steadily, and the thought was clearly forming in my head, everything will be done as needed. We were ready. The plan was made. Clara was on standby, ready to make her appearance at the perfect moment. All I had to do was play my part, the role of the blushing bride, who was about to become the queen of this absurd performance that Brian had staged himself. When I put on my wedding dress, I felt grief pierce my heart. This dress is an elegant ivory creation that was once a symbol of happiness for me. I thought this would be the moment when I stand in front of Brian and promise him eternal love. But now it was only part of the performance. The pain I felt was unbearable, but it quickly turned into determination. I was ready to get my power back. Brian stole enough from me. But today I will get back everything that was taken from me. The ceremony itself was a blur, everything seemed meaningless, as if I were part of some unhappy dream. I was walking down the aisle, and my father was beaming proudly next to me, his face full of pride, but I felt distant, as if everything that was happening was in another world. When I stopped in front of Brian, his handsome face shone in the light, and I saw through his eyes, the eyes of a man who hides his truth. I stood in front of him, knowing that all this time he was just a fake. And even though the words I was saying now sounded like ashes in my mouth, they were still said. I even managed to suppress the lump in my throat. It was only after it all started that I felt like everything was starting to fall apart. As we made our rounds, greeting guests and accepting congratulations, I couldn't help but notice how Brian was getting more and more worried. His eyes, which had seemed calm before, now darted from one place to another, as if he was looking for a way out of some unsolvable situation. He was constantly checking his phone, his fingers nervously clutching a glass of champagne, and an expression of anxiety appeared on his face more and more often, hidden behind a tense smile. At that moment, I felt a strange and unpleasant affection for this man, who thought he could continue to deceive me. "Is everything all right, dear?" I asked, addressing him with the sweetest intonation I could muster. Like a sugar drop, my words hit him, and I could see him flinch, almost dropping his glass. "Of course, just work, stuff like that, you know." His voice sounded strained, his eyes continued to jump restlessly around the room, not stopping in one place. I smiled tightly, trying to hide my victorious confidence that was burning in my chest. "Oh, I know exactly how it is." How exactly does he hide his true emotions behind this fake mask? Just at that moment, Louise appeared next to me. I took her hand, feeling her determination and support affect me. "It's time," she whispered, and I nodded. I took a deep breath and, as if letting go of the last of my doubts, headed for the small stage where the band was set up. I grabbed the microphone, gently tapped on it, attracting attention. The room froze, all eyes turned to me. "Friends, family, loved ones," I began, and my heart suddenly began to beat more evenly. I spoke surprisingly evenly, even though there were hundreds of storms raging inside me. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate this special day with Brian and me." The laughter in the corner of my heart was acrid and bitter. Brian was beaming, his eyes were full of expectation. He thought I was going to say something sentimental about our love, as always. If only he knew what I had prepared for him. "We're cutting the cake," I continued, grinning out loud. "But before that, I would like to invite someone else to join our celebration." I paused, enjoying every second of the tension that had gathered in the air. Clara, with obvious signs of pregnancy, made her way through the crowd, her face tense but determined. All the attention was on her, and I saw Brian turn pale. His eyes began to rush around the room in panic, and his lips moved, trying to squeeze out at least something to stop this moment. "Justine, what are you doing?" he hissed, barely able to contain his anger, but I ignored him. "I've already made my choice." "For those of you who don't know, this is Clara," I said, my words sounding loud and clear like a thunderclap in a clear sky. I turned my gaze to her, holding back the inner storm so that my speech would not give me away prematurely. "Brian's other wife and the mother of his child." There was silence in the room. The guests, Brian's colleagues, his friends, and everyone who knew him as a successful and intelligent man gasped. A whisper ran through the crowd like a harbinger of an impending storm. Brian's mother, Ethel, was making a strangled scream. Everyone started whispering to each other, trying to comprehend what was happening. "You see," I continued, feeling my heart finally find its rhythm, while Brian was planning this wedding with me, he was also building his life with Clara. I looked at her, and there was despair in her eyes, but also the realization that this was no longer just an aggravation of the situation. It was exposure, his naked soul. I pointed at Louise, who at that moment started projecting images onto the screen behind me. Everything we found in the vault, photos, financial records, lists of homes in other states was all there, documenting his lies. I was standing in front of this hall, and there was alarm in my voice, but it wasn't just pain, it was righteous indignation. "Brian Hunter is a liar, a fraud, and a coward," I said, and the words fell out of me like a heavy weight. My voice was shaking, but I stood there anyway, strong and unyielding. "And I stand before you, not as his bride, but as a woman who no longer wants to be deceived." The room was plunged into chaos. The noise of conversations, screams, footsteps, panic, it all merged into one storm. And even though I was standing in the middle of this storm, it was easy for me to breathe. Brian rushed onto the stage as if intending to rip the microphone out of my hands and erase everything I had just said. But David, his older brother, immediately stepped forward, holding him firmly by the shoulders. Disgust was reflected in his eyes, and at that moment I saw Brian freeze. His face was contorted with rage, but David, restraining him, did not allow him to take a single step. Clara stood motionless, her eyes were empty, and tears were rolling down her cheeks like warm rivulets. She stood with her fists clenched, but I knew she couldn't scream or resist. The reality of betrayal weighed heavily on her, irrevocably. She was faced with the fact that her own life, built on lies, was collapsing right in front of her. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, as if I had finally thrown off the shackles that held me in this nightmare. The truth was in the air now, and it had no return. No one could deny it anymore. There was no turning back now. Amid the noise and anxiety all around, I met Louise's gaze. She stood with an expression of pride, and her silent nod was like a support that gave me strength. I could see in her eyes that she understood that I was not alone. We're together, and whatever the outcome, we'll get through it. At that moment, her power became mine. Taking a deep breath, I turned back to the stunned crowd. The room froze, but now I knew what I had to do: open all the cards. My voice sounded clear and confident, barely hiding the smile that began to rise on my lips. "Who wants to hear the whole story?" I asked, and my words echoed in the crowded room. My voice was clear, with a hint of theft, as if I were challenging the whole world. The reception hall was plunged into chaos. The guests jumped up from their seats, shouting, gesticulating, as if trying to explain to themselves or others what was happening. Brian stood like a statue, his face frozen in a mask of shock and betrayal. He was dumbfounded, but his eyes continued to avoid my gaze, as if he was trying to hide from the fact that all this had come true. Clara, who was still standing next to me, burst into soft sobs, her body shaking with tears. I could feel her pain, but at that moment it didn't matter anymore. Everything I felt was directed at Brian, at his lies, at his manipulations. "Justine, how could you?" His voice cut through the space, a mixture of anger and despair, as if he wanted to shift the blame onto me, as always. He tried to hide his abominations behind the fog of his words. I laughed bitterly, and it sounded like a recoil in an empty hall. "On our wedding day? Do you mean the day you planned to reinforce your lie by trapping me in a marriage while you had a whole other family waiting in the wings?" I spoke slowly, feeling unbearable pain mixed with righteous anger with every word. Brian's mother, Ethel, burst into the crowd, her eyes darting between my son and me. She was trying to fight her way through, her hands trembling like a person who is faced with an impossible truth. "This is some kind of mistake," she pleaded, her voice barely holding back tears. "My son wouldn't do that. He's a good boy, a good boy." I grinned, feeling righteous satisfaction overwhelm me. "Why don't you ask your good boy about the house he bought for Clara? Or about their joint bank account? Or maybe about the wedding in Vegas that took place last summer?" Each question was a blow to her beliefs, and I saw her face crumple in shock and pain. Ethel turned to Brian, her eyes full of hope, as if she could still believe his lies. "Tell me it's not true," she begged him, her voice trembling. But Brian was silent, looking at the floor. His silence was all the confirmation we needed. At that moment, Brian's older brother, David, stepped forward. He looked tired, but his eyes were full of determination. "I always knew you were selfish, Brian, but this is a new low even for you," he said with cold determination. He seemed ready to meet his brother face to face and give this nightmare a final assessment. While this family drama was unfolding, I noticed that some of the guests began to leave the hall quickly, others huddled in corners, as if hiding from what was happening in front of them. Whispering furiously, my own family stood nearby, forming a protective circle around me. Their gazes were filled with doubt, surprise, and sometimes even fear, but none of them backed down. I felt the oppressive weight of the situation turning into the strength I needed to move on. We all became a united front, ready for what was coming. Suddenly, out of the blue, Brian rushed forward. He grabbed my arm, his fingers clenched like iron pincers, and for a moment I felt the pain of his grip. His eyes were burning, and there was a desperate need for control in them, but I was no longer giving in. "We need to talk in private," he hissed, his voice low and threatening, as if he wanted to make me believe his false promises again. Louise was there in an instant, jumping up to us like a defender ready to defend. She quickly and abruptly tore his hand away from mine, growling decisively. "You can't demand it anymore, Brian." But I raised my hand, making it clear that I wanted to solve this myself. I looked at her, and I saw complete understanding in her eyes. "It's okay, Louise," I said quietly. "I want to hear what he has to say." We moved to a corner, in the shadow of the curious eyes of the guests, who became sources of stress and pressure. It was only here, away from everyone, that I could meet this man who had once been a part of my life, and perhaps survive it all with minimal loss to my dignity. Brian's face was distorted by a storm of emotions. Anger, fear, and something resembling almost sincere regret were almost fighting for attention in his eyes. He stood in front of me, his chest heaving, and his hands nervously fidgeted with the edges of his shirt. "Why did you do that?" "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling, and there was so much pain in it that I almost felt sorry for him. But only almost. "Why couldn't you just talk to me alone?" I looked at him incredulously. Everything he said was so empty and so deceptive that it wasn't even worth answering right away. But I couldn't keep quiet. "Why?" I repeated, and my words sounded almost like a sentence. "Because you stole years of my life, Brian. You made me believe in a future that would never come. You were going to marry me, knowing that your wife and child were waiting for you at home." I paused to let my words sink in, but he still didn't understand the abyss of lies he was about to face. "Tell me, what part of this well-deserved privacy did you put your hand through, Brian?" I nodded at his fingers, which were still nervously touching his hair, trying to hide their guilt. "Where's your composure?" He closed his eyes for a few seconds, and then, opening them, forcefully said, "I love you, Justine, I really do. I just went overboard. Clara was a mistake. But then she got pregnant, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to tell you that." His words, like a clumsily mixed cocktail of lies and pity, could not deceive me. I looked at him with disdain, unable to hold back a grin. "How noble of you," I said, not hiding the irony in my voice. "I was going to end up with Clara," he added quickly, "after the wedding. I was going to tell her it was over." I laughed. It was a harsh, bitter laugh that seemed to echo throughout the room. "What about your baby, Brian? Were you going to leave them too?" I took a step forward, feeling the anger in my chest begin to boil, and I no longer wanted to hide it from him. His silence was deadly. He didn't know what to say, and it didn't matter to me anymore. My disgust became almost physical, rising in my throat. "Your pity." I spat, the words sounded like poison. "You've been nothing but a pathetic liar all this time, Brian." Meanwhile, I noticed Ethel, Brian's mother, approaching Clara, who was still standing in disbelief. She was lost, stunned by everything that was happening, and when I saw her, I felt a strange feeling of sympathy. But it wasn't something that could stop me. To my surprise, Ethel hugged Clara, and both women dissolved into tears, as if it was important for them to understand each other at that moment. The sight seemed to take the last remnants of my resolve out of me. I suddenly realized that it wasn't just about me, but about Clara and her innocent child, who were caught in Brian's web of lies. They deserved the truth as much as I did. I turned back to Brian. My heart was beating steadily, and I knew that his time was over. "It's over, Brian," I said, not looking away. "Not just our relationship, but your whole Cade. I want you out of my life. And I'm pretty sure Clara will feel the same way once the shock wears off." Brian's face was distorted with panic, his eyes seemed full of horror, almost animal fear. I could hear his voice tremble as he spoke. "Justine, please, we'll handle this. I'll do anything, just don't leave me for a moment." He came up to me, his hand reached out, but I could barely contain my rage, almost knocking him down. My fingers curled into a fist, and I almost didn't hit him. But at that moment, I remembered every lie, every betrayal, every disappointment that he had brought to me over the past 3 years. I remembered his cold, sly eyes when he promised me a future that I now knew did not exist. "Goodbye, Brian," I said firmly, not even giving myself a chance to doubt. I turned around, turned my back on this man who had once been a part of my life, and walked back to my family. Lifting my head high, I felt this heavy weight finally slip off my shoulders, this stone that I carried with me, despite all the signs that the path ahead would be much more difficult. But at that moment, as I walked to my loved ones, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I didn't know what exactly was waiting for me. I could almost feel something breaking inside of me. The step I took was a decision, but not yet completed, and it became clear to me. Little did I know that the biggest problem was still ahead. When I turned away from Brian, the weight of what I had done hit me like a tidal wave. The reception hall turned into a sea of shocked faces, gripped by whispers and pointing fingers. All those looks seemed to condemn me, but I couldn't look in their direction anymore. I didn't care. I would have exposed Brian's lies if it hadn't been for one sudden realization. At what cost? And suddenly Brian's voice cut through the room like a bolt from the blue. Do you think you've won, Justine? You've ruined everything. I turned around, and my gaze met his, full of rage and fear. He was red with anger, seething, almost in the heat of the moment. He was rapidly approaching me like a storm, and at that moment I felt the tension in the room reach its climax. Louise immediately stepped between us, but Brian, without hesitation, pushed her aside. "Brian, stop!" Clara screamed, her hands protectively pressed against her stomach, as if she was trying to hide herself and her unborn child from this chaos. I could see her face covered in horror. But Brian was no longer paying attention to her. He was beyond reason. "You had no right!" he screamed, grabbing my arm, so that the pain cut through my body again. "You had no right to ruin my life like that." His voice sounded like a sentence, but I no longer felt anything but rage. I pulled my hand away, and breaking through the anger that overwhelmed me, I said, "Your life?" I almost shouted, my voice full of disgust. "What about my life, Brian? What about Clara? You ruined our lives with your lies." There was silence in the room. All eyes were on us as the epicenter of this tragic performance. It was a moment of truth, and I knew that everything that was happening couldn't be fixed anymore. Brian's facade collapsed. He was no longer the man I once loved. "I never meant to offend anyone," he said, his voice breaking, and I could almost hear the regret in it. But it wasn't something I could accept. I couldn't. "Choose," I interrupted him. "Choose, Brian. You can't be with both of us at the same time. You lied to all of us, and this is the result." Bitter laughter burst out of me like a volcanic eruption, and I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop when I looked at this man, who all this time claimed that he loved me, that he was worried. He didn't know what love was. And then Ethel, his mother, came closer. I could see her eyes filling with tears, but they were filled not only with grief, but also with despair. She was looking at Brian, and disappointment was written on her face. "Brian, how could you do that?" Her voice was low, but full of pain. He turned to her, and his face reflected not only despair, but also something like fear. He was trapped, and I knew it, even if he couldn't admit it to himself. "Mom, please, you have to understand, I'm trapped." His voice was almost pleading, but I couldn't believe a single word he said anymore. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know what to do. Ethel shook her head, and disappointment covered her face like a dark cloud. She could no longer hide what was now obvious. Her son had ruined not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. "This can't be fixed, Brian," I said calmly, even though my chest was burning with rage and pain. "You've broken too many hearts." For a moment, everything was quiet, as if time had stood still. All eyes were on Brian, and I saw his eyes begin to fill with despair. But his panic was already too late a reaction. Clara seemed to take a step forward, her hands clenched into fists. I could see her face contorting with a mixture of pain and anger. Her voice was trembling, but there was a strength in it that I didn't expect from her. She wasn't talking to me, not to Brian. She was talking about all of us. "I trusted you, Brian. her words echoed in the air. I believed every word you said, and so did you. How could he lie to us for so long? Her words penetrated like a knife into the very heart. But Brian was standing in front of us, his shoulders hunched, and he looked so defeated that I even felt sorry for him. But it wasn't enough. All he could say was, "I'm sorry," he whispered, hardly believing what he was saying. "I'm really sorry." But regret wasn't enough. Not for me. Not for Clara. Not for everyone who was in this room, who saw how life was being destroyed, who stood in the very epicenter of this explosion. I didn't need his apologies. I had already seen who he was, and I couldn't believe a word he said anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to hide the storm that was raging inside from everyone. I needed to do this, decide what I knew I needed to do next. I couldn't stay in this farce any longer, in this simulation of a relationship that was supposed to be a wedding. I looked at Brian and, restraining my own emotions, said, "Brian," my voice was even, firm. I could feel my words echoing in his soul, like heavy stones falling into an empty abyss. "It's over. This farce of a wedding is over. And any relationship between us is over." A collective sigh swept through the room, as if the air had suddenly become too dense. I saw a flash of panic in Brian's eyes, as he suddenly realized that he was losing everything. But he didn't give up. He grabbed my hand, his voice was full of desperate pleading. "Justine, no, please, we'll figure this out. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me." His words sounded like the last cry of a man who was drowning. I hesitated. The man I loved for many years begged me to stay, begged me to forgive him. It was the point where everything inside me almost broke. I felt his petition tearing at my heart, but I remembered every lie, every betrayal, every moment of happiness that was built on deception. Everything I went through with him turned out to be an illusion. I gently pulled his hands out of my dress and, looking into his eyes, said softly, "Goodbye, Brian." When I left, I felt the walls shrink around me, as if I was tearing something in my soul. But my resolve was unshakable. I came out of this hell with my head held high, and every step made me feel better. Suddenly, there was applause. It was strange, completely unexpected, and for a moment I stopped. But as soon as I heard the first applause begin to sound, I realized that it was support. Louise started, then David, and then the others. The applause sounded like a slow-moving stream, and the room filled with this sound seemed to be part of another world, a world where I could be free. I walked to the door, turning around one last time to look at Brian. He was still on his knees, broken, alone, as if everything he was had just fallen apart. But it wasn't my business anymore. There was no place for me in his life. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. Clara was standing next to Ethel, and although both women looked shocked, I noticed how their support for each other made them stronger. Their bond became more tangible, like two women who had endured pain and were willing to stick together. They seemed like something that could survive in this chaos. And my family and friends behind me have kind of closed the circle. They surrounded me, ready to support me in what comes next, no matter what the future brings. When I stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I felt a strange lightness. I exhaled, letting go of everything that held me, and felt like life, although full of shocks, was opening up a new path for me. I felt a mixture of emotions that I couldn't name. Relief, grief, anger, hope, all this swirled in a confusing whirlpool. At that moment, I realized that I was experiencing many opposite feelings at the same time. But one thing was clear: it was the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. Whatever challenges lay ahead, would face them, because now I had the truth on my side, and more importantly, the support of those who truly love me. The way forward was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free, like a bird spreading its wings after a long imprisonment. The days after the wedding failure became a fog of emotions and revelations. My feelings, which had not had time to settle down, merged into one big vortex. I was sitting in Louise's guest room, alternately sipping a cup of coffee, feeling the hot drink warm me up, but it couldn't overshadow the cold emptiness that remained in my chest. From time to time, my phone received calls from friends, family, and sometimes reporters who were looking for juicy details about Brian's two-faced life. Their annoying calls didn't stop, as if they hoped to find a sensation in my pain. But I was no longer interested in their curiosity. On the third day, while Louise and I were cheekily feeding cups of coffee, when there was no sound left in the room, there was an unexpected doorbell. Louise and I looked at each other, not expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Richard, Brian's father, was standing in front of me, with his dilapidated face full of concern and, perhaps, shame. He looked like everything in him was reaching out for redemption, although he probably didn't know what exactly needed to be redeemed yet. "I hope I'm not interrupting." His voice was low, almost inaudible, and I noticed him swallow nervously before continuing. "I just needed to talk to you." We silently invited him into the house, and he sat down in an armchair in the living room, still nervous. Richard's eyes were full of tears, and his hands were trembling slightly. He began to speak, and his every word seemed to penetrate to the very depths of my heart, leaving long shadows of memories behind. "I want you to know how deeply I regret what my son did," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And how much I admire your courage, your determination to express the truth." These words, spoken with such respect, touched me more than I could have expected. I felt the weight of recent events ease a little, although the bitterness did not go away. He was not guilty of his son's actions, but his sincere regret made me feel that not everything in this story is lost. "Thank you, Richard," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, which I needed right now. "It means a lot." Richard nodded, but there was doubt on his face. He hesitated, as if he did not dare to continue. But then, as if he had made up his mind, he spoke again. "There's something else you should know." His words carried some weight. I was wary because I felt that he was ready to reveal something to me that could change everything. Brian's behavior. This is not entirely surprising to me. You see, I left his mother many years ago because I discovered that she cheated on me throughout our marriage. These words struck me like lightning. I froze, unable to immediately realize what I had just heard. All this time, I thought that Brian and his mother were victims of circumstances. But now, hearing Richard bluntly declare his infidelity and that it was a source of family discord, I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. "Does Brian know?" I asked, trying to make some sense of this revelation. Richard shook his head. "Ethel and I agreed never to tell him," he continued. "We thought we were protecting him, that he shouldn't know about what happened. But now, after all that has happened, I wondered if we had set him up, if we had forced him to repeat our mistakes." His words echoed in my soul. I felt something change inside me. The anger that had been so hot and destructive until recently began to cool down, giving way to deep sadness. I felt sad because I realized that all of us, me, Brian, and his parents, were hostages of our past mistakes. We all followed the same path, covered with resentments and betrayals, not noticing that we were stepping on the same rake, not seeing how our own actions affect the future. And at that moment, while Richard was talking, my phone rang. Clara's name appeared on the screen. I thought about it, but without thinking, I pressed the answer button. I needed to hear her. "Can we meet?" "What is it?" she asked. There was a hint of something important in her voice that she wanted to say. "I think we both need to finish this." An hour later, Clara and I were sitting in a quiet cafe, where the light aroma of freshly baked bread and coffee filled the air, and the street lights danced with reflections in the windows. Her newborn son was sleeping peacefully in a carrier next to her, hardly breaking the silence that hung between us, heavy with unspoken pain and general betrayal. I felt like we were both stuck in this moment, between what was and what will be. "I'm sorry," Clara finally said, her voice soft, barely breaking through the inner heaviness. She was looking into the distance, avoiding my eyes. If I had known. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was such a simple, but at the same time incredibly important action, the support that we both sought, despite the complexity of our situation. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "We were both deceived. You know that Brian has always been a master of lies." Clara looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a reflection of my own fear and pain. We started talking, sharing stories with each other, piecing together all of Brian's deceptions like pieces of one big puzzle that no longer fit into the old picture. There was a strange, almost inappropriate connection between us. We were two women who loved the same man, two women wounded by the same lie, now facing an uncertain future that we both had to deal with. "What are you going to do now?" I asked, not trying to hide the anxiety that was breaking through my voice. Clara looked at her son as if her gaze sought solace in his peaceful smile. "I'm going to build a life for us," she replied. There was an amazing mix of determination and love in her voice. Honest, filled with love. "Brian, he will always be my son's father. But he won't be a part of our lives until he proves he's changed. It's not going to be easy, but I know I can do it." Her words resonated deeply with me. How could I not understand that her power is the same power that I began to discover in myself? It was a moment when I felt that I could still move forward, that despite everything that had happened, I had the opportunity to start over, and this chance was in my hands. When we broke up, I felt a strange but necessary sense of closure. I didn't realize that I needed this particular evening, with Clara and her little son, to completely cut off the past in order to stay true to myself and my future. I didn't know that new beginnings were waiting for me, but I was no longer afraid of it. Later, when Louise and I drank a bottle of wine, I felt the tension that bound my body and soul begin to let go. I was almost back to a state of calm when my phone rang. It was Brian. "Justin, please," he begged into the phone. His voice sounded tired, full of despair. "Can we talk? I know I screwed up, but I love you. Can we start over? Can we fix this?" I took a deep breath. His words didn't affect me the way they used to. I was surprised at how calmly I could respond. "No, Brian," I said, holding back the slight irritation that was still bubbling inside. "We can't. What you did is not something we can come back from. I hope you get help." "I really hope so, but my future doesn't include you." When I hung up, there was silence in the room, but it was different, calm and cleansing. Louise, sitting across from me, raised her glass of wine. "To new beginnings," she said with a proud smile, and I saw the same light in her eyes as in my own. "To new beginnings," I repeated, feeling a lightness fill me. A lightness I haven't felt in weeks, maybe months. I woke up early the next morning, although the night was long and restless. I got dressed, packed up and went for a walk in the park near Louise's house. The wind gently tugged at my hair, and the first morning sun was already shining on the horizon. It rose, painting bright shades of pink and gold in the sky. I was walking through the morning park, enjoying the silence, and at that moment I was overcome by a sense of peace. Yes, my fairy tale wedding turned into a nightmare. Yes, the man I thought I was going to spend my life with betrayed me in the worst possible way. But standing there, watching the world around me wake up, I realized something profound. I was stronger than I had ever known. I faced my worst fear, public humiliation, heartbreak, and the destruction of all my dreams. But not only did I survive, I came out of it all with my head held high, surrounded by people who truly loved and supported me. And I was ready to move forward. When I turned back, I noticed a figure walking towards me. It was Marilyn, our longtime family friend. She came up to me and, without saying a word, hugged me tightly, like a mother who sees in you something more than just her friend. "How are you, dear?" "What is it?" she asked, her eyes full of maternal concern. I smiled, surprised at how sincerely I felt that I was all right. I said, "Actually, I'm more than fine. I am free." And at that moment, I knew it was true. The road ahead may be uncertain, but for the first time in years, I was excited to see where it could lead me. My story is not over. It was just beginning.